Thank you very much. I apologise to everybody here that I slightly delayed the start of the conference. I was rushing around. I feel, in fact, thinking it's the International Bar Association is one of our sponsors. I feel a bit like a jobbing barrister today, moving, or parliamentary equivalent, moving from, I don't know, cross-channel migrants to stopping the Saudis executing people to SLAPP. So that's today's agenda, as it were. But oh, and by the way, I'm also I'm a pro-privacy, anti-surveillance campaigner. So being in this high-tech place full of cameras may make me a bit uncomfortable, but never mind. I'm delighted to be here today at the Anti-SLAPP Conference. We've brought together so many people from across the political spectrum in defence of free speech and the free press. And as you've just heard, the global magnitude and seriousness of what at its widest is almost every possible method to intimidate free spirits is incredibly serious and should grasp our attention. But today I'm going to be rather more parochial and local and talk about Britain mostly because, well, for a variety of reasons. Obviously, I care about it, but also because we have become the nexus of much of this activity for reasons which we ought to be able to control. Now, in January, my colleagues and I had a debate on the subject of SLAPPs in the House of Commons. And in all honesty, although at the time it didn't attract an enormous amount of attention, it was just about the highest quality debate on a technical subject I have ever heard in the House. I mean, down to my parliamentary colleagues like Liam Byrne, Bob Seeley, Margaret Hodge, and a whole variety of others. And as a result, it's become almost a reference point for what's followed on from it. So I'm hugely grateful to my colleagues, my fellow MPs, to ensure that this particular branch of lawfare, as it were, got the attention it deserved. And of course, that, as time would have it, was just before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which suddenly made the issue of corruption in the UK, oligarchs, our sort of nexus of influence and our locus of, as it were, post-Soviet activity in the West, brought it right to the fore. And that has reinforced our case. It hasn't strengthened it, because it's always an absolutely strong case, but it has reinforced, as it were, public interest. All of a sudden, I can go to my constituency and people in the street will stop me and talk about SLAPPs. That would never have happened before the Ukraine, I suspect. So first after that came the implementation of sanctions on Russia and Putin's cronies, of course, many of whom are using the UK as a laundromat for their dirty money, for their corrupt activities. And I have, again, I forgive my slightly parochial view of this, but I always have in my mind the three Bs, which is Belton, Burrows, and Burgess, who have done more than most to shine a light on the abuse of bribery, the abuse of power, the bribery, the corruption, the blackmail, the money laundering, the coercion, the intimidation. I could go on, that seem to be the hallmarks of those post-Soviet states, but not just those post-Soviet states, as we've heard from the first speaker. And they epitomize exactly why free speech matters. Because only with free speech can we expose the corruption that undermines and weakens the great society that we Brits are lucky to live in. A major victory was scored in March when the libel case against Tom Burgess and HarperCollins was dismissed in the High Court. Incidentally, I won't talk about this, but it does actually indicate how the judiciary themselves are beginning to understand and act, as it were, almost preemptively on this matter, that the judges in that section of our courts are taking I nearly said taking the law into their own hands, but I suppose judges don't do that. The law is always in their hands. So that was a major success. And in recent months we've had another lawfare debate in Parliament. We hosted last week the Anti-SLAPP Coalition's model law launch, and we've got a commitment. Most important of all, we have a commitment from the British government to act on the issue of SLAPPs. Now, we don't know when the government will act, of course, always a problem, or exactly what kind of action it will take. but it clearly recognizes that it's a serious problem and that it has a responsibility to do something about it. I mean, that is a big advance for it. So in that sense, we have won round one. We've won round one. A long way to go, and it's worth remembering why we're fighting this fight in the first place. So as I've said, I'm incredibly lucky to live in this country, and the fundamental values around which our society is built, free speech, parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, are not mirrored in every part of the world. Probably half the world's population does not have, well, certainly more than half does not have all of those things, and half the world's population don't have any of them really. So as I say, a huge proportion of the world do not share the freedoms we have, and many of the countries we all come from have. But from a British point of view, a lot of those people look to the UK as a model for many in the world, an ideal to aspire to. And the fact that they do not share those freedoms shows that why we can't take them for granted. They're not God-given. They were fought for over many hundreds of years by many heroes, known and unknown, in the past. And they still have to be fought for today, both here and, of course, abroad, as we've heard. So lawfare and SLAPPs in particular pose a direct threat to those values we hold so dear. And it does so in two ways. Firstly, it undermines the principle of fairness that's built into, we have a legal system that's world-renowned. And yet it's very basic, and the basis of a good legal system is fairness, and that is being undermined by the tactics being used in the form of SLAPPs. In theory, we're all equal before the law. And yet SLAPPs allow the rich and powerful to flex their financial and political muscle against their critics. And in doing so, they make a mockery of our courts and evade justice. Secondly, lawfare, as we've already heard, represents a direct attack on free speech and the free press. Legal action, or even the threat of it, is being deployed almost on a whim by oligarchs in order to terrify journalists into silence. Now, I've never been the victim of a SLAPP, but there'll be people here who today who can testify quite how crippling it is to be hit by one. Few of those who are targeted by SLAPPs can afford to fight the case unless they are supported by their own media organizations or some other corporate support. Even though the oligarchs often have a very slim chance of success, the sheer expense involved in defending your case can be absolutely devastating. That's even without going into the stress, the anxiety, the impact on your career and your family, the black cloud that hangs over you for years on end. And the oligarchs know this. They don't really care whether they win their SLAPP cases. Those they're accusing will likely back down and withdraw their criticism, or simply go bankrupt trying to defend themselves. Either way, the problems journalists are dealt with, the problem journalists are dealt with, and the scrutiny is avoided. And what's more, any journalist who is thinking about applying some scrutiny has to think twice. And many will decide to abandon it altogether for fear of being hit by a SLAPP themselves. Even when it's not SLAPPs, I mean, time after time in the last few years, I've been involved with very big newspaper organizations who have backed off really important stories out of simple fear of being taken on by somebody who's wealthy enough to misuse the law. And as a result, of course, some media organizations avoid some issues altogether. And when I talk about SLAPPs, I always remind you, and I'm going to do it, I've done it already, but I'm going to do it again, of how horrible it is to be on the receiving end. The anxiety, the fear of financial destruction, the damage to your career, the horrible black cloud. And also what people don't talk about. I mean, journalists are creative individuals. Their brain is their asset. And just think what it does, not just to the case you're dealing with, but all the rest of your work. If you are living in daily fear of a case, your creativity gets destroyed. So it's even more corrosive than it looks at first sight. And so we all pay a price for it, not just those who are unfortunate enough to be on the end of a SLAPP. The damage done to our legal system and the harm done to press freedom mean that we lack the tools to take head on those authoritarians who would see our values wrecked. And so the oligarchs can go on using and abusing our country. and its values to pursue their own nefarious ends. This, then, is what we're fighting for: free speech and the rule of law, and the very nature of our society. Now, that's the background to the Anti-SLAPP Coalition's model anti-SLAPP law, which we launched last week. And I'm sure there'll be other speakers here today will share more information about the details of the proposal. But I think it's worth just touching briefly on the core ideas behind it. It's some of which we've copied from other countries. Namely that courts should be able to dismiss egregious SLAPP cases early on, long before they cripple the accused financially. Secondly, the costs of bringing a SLAPP case should be prohibitively high. And thirdly, the cost of the defendant should be minimised. These three really quite simple steps are critical to laying the foundations of a legal level playing field and restoring the principle of equality before the law. We often forget, in Britain, we have a very, very high quality law system, legal system, but it's also a very, very expensive one. And the price of that expense sometimes is equality before the law. The job we now have is to press the government to act quickly, to act decisively, and to act effectively. This is a delicate area where it's easy to get it wrong. So whilst we want fast legislation, we also want well thought through legislation, which is why the model legislation was so important. At the best of times, it's difficult to get government to focus on any one particular issue. It'll be even harder now, considering the level of the challenges facing the country and the world, from the economic situation here to the war in Ukraine. So we're going to have to work hard and be persistent. Now, as many of you know, the Anti-SLAPP Coalition has sent an open letter to the Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, on this subject, and it's backed by Fleet Street editors, authors, King's Counsel, and media chiefs, as well as politicians like myself. And it's exactly the kind of pressure we need to bring to apply to the government. Now, in Dominic Raab, I do believe he takes this subject very seriously. We've obviously debated in the chamber, but I've also spoken to him privately about it, and I'm optimistic that if we keep up the pressure, we'll get somewhere. But it relies on us hammering away for as long as it takes. So we should greet every bit of progress as another reason to fight on. We have got this far, so let's keep pushing. And of course, we have to be balanced on the way we go about this. It's not automatically wrong to sue journalists. We never have, but temptation may always be there. But it's not automatically wrong to sue a journalist who gets things wrong. But, we all make mistakes. And sometimes some people behave maliciously. Libel laws exist for a legitimate reason. But we can all agree that the law is not there to be used to shut down genuine debate and proper scrutiny, particularly of the evils that afflict our society today. Now, again, the first speaker said that the battle against SLAPPs is not just a British affair. In the US, more than 30 states have passed anti-SLAPP laws, offering varying degrees of protection. In some cases, they allow journalists and media organisations to file motions to dismiss such suits at an early stage on the grounds that the cases involve protected speech on a matter of public interest. And as we've heard again, closer to home, the EU is also moving to restrict this particular form of lawfare through legislation. The trend then is towards confronting those who use these evil methods. It's crucial that Britain is not left behind. In fact, the issue is arguably more urgent here in London than anywhere else. Just as London became the world capital of money laundering prior to the war on Ukraine, British legal jurisdiction is now the dream landscape in which the rich and powerful can try to suppress their critics. And as other countries limit the space in which SLAPPs can be brought, more and more ultra-wealthy people will look to the UK as their preferred battlefield. So we've already acted to purge London of some of the dirty money that's flowed through it in recent years. It is time we applied the same reforming zeal to flushing out the oligarchs from our courts. The other reason that it's important for UK to act is that other countries will likely take their lead from the UK in tackling this issue. There are no doubt people here who've been hit with SLAPPs overseas. For their sake, the UK needs to show global leadership in this respect. And of course, many of the SLAPP cases brought here in the UK are brought by people who are based overseas. Some of them former politicians in other countries' governments. And SLAPPs spawn other sins, like intrusive surveillance. Hacking, for example, is often used in pursuit of hacks, using as an illegal form of surveillance, using disreputable private investigators. A recent Sunday Times BIJ investigation, that's Bureau of Investigative Journalism investigation, showed how it spanned from, this is hacking, from India through Switzerland, Russia and the Middle East, but all around a focus on London's rather slapdash and unregulated investigative industry. So there's enormous global dimension to this. And sadly, London, once again, is the nexus of it. So the corrosive and knock-on effect of SLAPPs affects many, many other things, including things like that. So all of this confirms why events like this are so very important. As Liam Byrne rightly said at last week's anti-SLAPP model law launch in Parliament, politicians and journalists do not always find themselves on the same side of the argument, to put it mildly. But when it comes to defending the free press, my colleagues and I will stand with you for as long as it takes. The press plays an absolutely fundamental role in a healthy democracy, and we must never take it for granted. MPs, of course, have parliamentary privilege, and some of you may know we've been using this to promote this cause. It's allowed us to name and shame people who are using our legal system to silence journalists without fear of litigation ourselves. I have to tell you, the law firms involved in this area of work find that a little hard to take, which leads to the odd amusing exchange. And I probably shouldn't name the lawyers, I suppose, but I've had, you can guess, I've had several solicitors' letters that were obviously designed to be intimidating. And of course, if I didn't have parliamentary privilege, they would be. But instead, they end up somewhere being pathetic and hilarious. So it provides me a little private entertainment when we're doing all of this. So it's only right that we use privilege to speak up for those who lack the same protections. But the real leaders in this fight are you guys. The journalists, the reporters, the writers and the activists who are making it all happen. Without you, we would be nowhere in this crucial fight. And so I say to you in the room, but also the virtual audience, I urge all of you to take this opportunity to make connections with the many people who are united in this fight for free speech. The government will be reactive, not proactive, so we have to force the change on this issue. As I say, we've won round one. It's an amateur bout, so only round 2 and 3 to go. But we've got to keep pushing on it, and I'm hugely encouraged by the interest the campaign has drawn. It's going from strength to strength, and we're getting closer and closer to a major legislative change. And with the strength of feeling in this room today and all the energy going into this battle, I am sure we're going to be successful. Thank you.